Here's a look at all the books I read in January and what I thought about them. First, let's take a look at some numbers. I am terrified of numbers, but for some reason when it comes to reading, I find them fascinating. So I read 8 books this month, and for me, that's pretty good. I mean, that's really good. Usually I tend to read like 6 or 7, so killing it. I read 2,814 pages, and it took me about 6 days to complete each book. I always make an admission for me to read an equal amount of fiction and nonfiction each month. Usually I get pretty close, but pretty rarely do I hit it spot on, and this month hit it spot on, 50-50, and my average rating was 3.94, sorry. Every month I also make an admission to read from as many countries as possible, and I categorize the books by countries based on 1, if the book takes place in that country or is about that country, or 2, if the author is from that country. And usually those align. But this month I read from 7 different countries, which I think is pretty great. So I read from Sweden, the Philippines, the US, Japan, Egypt, and Rwanda. But now let's get started with the actual books. I started off the reading year with a disappointing read, and that was A Study in Drowning. I've been meaning to read from Ava Reid for a while because I knew that her writing style I would really connect with because it's like really lush and lyrical, and I did actually really enjoy the writing style of this. I think my favorite part of this book was actually the environment that she created and the atmosphere that she created and the gothic feel of this book. But that's kind of where my like of this book died. This book is about a young girl in this world where when you go to school, you choose what you study, just like this world. But for some reason, women aren't allowed to study literature. That's never like really explained, they're just not allowed. And that's what she really wants to do, but she is stuck being an architect in an architecture school. And one day a really famous author in this world dies, and he is like an author where a lot of folk tales in this world are based on, and he's really revered and even worshipped. She is chosen as an architecture student to go to his old house and redesign his house for him. And then there's a literature student who's also there that is tasked with studying his life. And when they get there, things are not what they seem, and just kind of goes from there. Again, I really liked the gothic feel of this, and like the general storyline, like the skeleton of the story had a lot of promise, but it really, really fell flat with the characters and the actual plotting of this book. The characters were really frustrating, and I am not pretending to be like a smart reader by any means, but I feel like I predicted the twists and the turns and the realities of this book 100, if not more, pages before the main characters. And when you figure out a plot twist before, that can be a really satisfying thing, but not when you have to read hundreds of pages of the main characters trying to figure it out, and you're like, it is right in front of you. The answer is right there. What are you doing? So that was really, really frustrating. But I would say the most frustrating part of this book was actually the romance of it. The main character treated the love interest horribly. So the love interest, it was from a neighboring land that they have had wars with in the past, and there's a lot of prejudice against them. And she brought in those prejudices to the forefront and really treated him horribly because of it. And what could have been a really good character arc of her grappling with those things and learning how to confront her prejudices really fell flat. There was maybe one line where she was like, oh, oops, sorry. And I think that was a really great disservice to exploring this topic as a whole. And I also just don't believe the fact that you can have such a prejudice against a person and then a couple pages later be like, oh, but I love him. It just doesn't make sense. So yeah, disappointing read. However, the next read really turned things around and is my favorite nonfiction book of the month, and that is Cockroaches. This is a memoir about a woman who lived through the Rwandan genocide. This was such a powerful book in many obvious ways, and in many ways that I think are really important to call out. This was a really important story of not just telling her own story, but also being a witness and telling other people's stories of lives who were destroyed and forgotten, and the importance of keeping those stories and those people alive through their stories. I also thought it was a really important story that really goes to show how genocide isn't something that just happens overnight, and it is something that is meticulously planned and happens over time. This is her story of her family's displacement time and time again, struggling to find a home, and then grappling with the fact that they see this coming and what to do about it, and the sacrifices her family had to make. I cannot recommend this enough. It is obviously a hard read, but I think the fact that it is such an important piece of her telling the stories of every single person that she knew in her town that were slaughtered. She's telling their stories because no one else will. And I think that's so incredibly important, and I think we should all be witness to that. Then I read the worst book I read this year so far, and probably one of the worst books I've ever read in my entire life. And that is Are the Placebo by Joe Dispenza. I read this book for a self-help deep dive, and I was expecting it to be bad, but I wasn't expecting it to be like on par of like The Secret as bad and like dangerous. Essentially, the main thesis of this whole book and of Joe Dispenza himself, who is a fraud, he's a chiropractor. You should not be trusting him with any kind of neuropsychology. Okay, let's just throw that out there. Secondly, his main thesis is that you can cure literally anything, including cancer and depression, if you meditate and change the reality in your mind. Essentially, think positively until you think away your cancer. This is so incredibly dangerous. I go on a huge deep dive on my Substack if you want to learn more. I'll also do a longer Substack on here, so keep your eye on that. But stay as far away from this book and Joe Dispenza as possible. Then I read a really lovely fantasy called Water Moon. This book is super whimsical, and I think this cover portrays the vibes perfectly. I had such a fun time with this book. This book takes place in Japan, but it's kind of in two worlds. You have the normal human world, and then you have this really lush, magical world that our main character is a part of. And she is in charge of running this pawn shop with her father, and this pawn shop trades in regrets from the human world. So humans walk into this pawn shop, they don't know where they are, they give away a regret, and they go back out into the real world, and that regret is erased from their life. My mic dies, so you're just gonna have to deal with the change of audio. But one day, this pawn shop owner, her dad goes missing. He disappears, and a man walks into the pawn shop, and together they go find her dad, and they just go on this magical journey through all these different worlds, and it's so lovely. I really loved how this book explored choices, regrets, and free will. And then I read my favorite fiction book of the month, and that is A Dance of Lies. Unfortunately, this book doesn't come out in June, and I'm like dying to talk about it to someone because it's so good. Literally obsessed with it. This book is a fantasy book that follows this young woman who was one of the king's favorite dancers, and they were really close. And then one day he frames her for murder, and she is locked in prison for 2 years. And during that time, she obviously goes through a lot of trauma. And then one day, the king takes her out and is like, hey, you can have your freedom if you act as a spy at this event for me. And so she does, and things kind of unravel from there. The best part of this book for me was a representation of chronic illness and pain and PTSD. I think a lot of times in fantasy books, you see the main character go through really horrible things at the beginning of the book, and then that is never like grappled with. And I think this did it so beautifully and in such a caring way. The author herself has a chronic illness, and I think that is very evident in the way that this topic is approached. And as someone with PTSD, I thought that that was represented extremely well. And from this, I thought the character arc of our main character was beautiful. It made me kind of tear up at the end, I'm not gonna lie. But I thought it was really cool to see a main character in a fantasy setting that shows what strength can look like beyond just like brute force. But another part of this book that I really loved were all the characters. They were all pretty gray, but at the same time, you fell in love with every single one of them. Well, maybe not in love, but you empathize with every single one of them. None of them were perfect, but you were still rooting for some of them. And just like, I loved all the relationships together and the complexity of that. So yeah, when this book comes out in June, please pick it up so I can finally talk to someone about it. Also, this book is the author's debut novel, and I'm just blown away by that. And also, this cover is one of the most gorgeous fantasy covers I've seen in a long time. Next, I picked up another 5-star nonfiction book, and this is an incredible piece of journalism called Some People Need Killing. This is about a topic that I admittedly knew nothing about. I didn't even know what happened, let alone any of the details about it. And it is about the war on drugs in the Philippines. And this author is a journalist from the Philippines, and she has been reporting on this and the deaths during and after this occurred. And the journalism is just like an immaculate representation of what journalism should be. This book explores Rodrigo Duterte's rise to power in the Philippines and how he used rhetoric and weaponizing the police force while utilizing private contracts and militias to help cover violence and the reality of extrajudicial killings with both adults and children during this time. It's really hard to understand how many people were actually killed during this time due to a war on drugs and getting rid of dangerous criminals from the street. Again, children were killed. It's really hard to estimate the exact number of these deaths, but it is estimated that between 2016 and 2022, 12,000 to 30,000 civilians were killed. The ICC has opened up a case of crimes against humanity for this, and sadly, it is still going on today to a smaller extent, but it is still happening. 342 people were killed from 2023 to 2024. I think it's really important because we see how rhetoric is weaponized against certain groups of people today in the US. And I think this is a warning sign of what could be if that rhetoric is not questioned. I also read How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which I've been meaning to read for years, and honestly, I wish I read it earlier. This book was written in 2020 and talks about the climate crisis and protests. This book is really a call to action about the importance of violent protests, meaning the protests involving destruction of property when it comes to climate change, and how that is something that's actually going to make change occur, because we have spent so long trying to do peaceful protests and that has gotten us nowhere. What I really appreciate about this book is that he went into examples of the past that are usually weaponized by people saying, well, peaceful protests work, we have to do it peacefully. And he talks about the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, Gandhi, as how oftentimes people are saying, we have to do something like that. Those were peaceful protests that worked, when in reality, those protests were not peaceful. The civil rights movement was far from peaceful. The suffrage movement largely relied on destruction of property. And I think it's just really important to look at these instances of history and not ignore the fact that violence was necessary. I did wish this book went into more detail in some of these areas, but overall, I think it's a really good, brief introduction to this idea. And then I read another fantasy book. I'm loving fantasy right now. That's called the Jasad Heir, that I really enjoyed. This book is an Egyptian-inspired fantasy, and it is in this world where there were a bunch of different kingdoms, and one kingdom, the Jasad kingdom, was a kingdom that had power and magic. And one day, the other kingdoms come in, and there's basically like a red wedding moment, and they murder everyone in the royal family and start persecuting and hunting down what is left of the kingdom. It has been years and years since then, and what everyone doesn't know is that the heir survived that event, and that is our main character. And she has been on the run her entire life. She doesn't have access to her magic even, and then one day the prince of the kingdom who killed her entire family finds her and enters her into a tournament that happens every single year. The world building of this book was extremely complex and lush, and I really loved it. It did make for like a slow start and build of the actual storyline. So I will warn against that it doesn't really pick up the plot until maybe like a fourth of the way through. It's really focused on understanding these characters and understanding the world they're in. But once it kicks off, I could not put it down. I thought the characters were so interesting. Again, all of their relationships with each other were fascinating, and I really loved understanding the motives of every single one of them, and I just thought it was lovely. I will say another warning about this book is that I saw that it was in the romantasy section for the Goodreads Choice Awards the year it came out, and I would not consider this a romantasy book, like, at all. There is a romantic subplot, but like nothing really happens or is like even acknowledged about it until 90% of the way through the book. So if you want a romance heavy book, this is absolutely not it. But if you want a fantasy that is really focused on political intrigue and maneuvering and strategy, this is the book. Those were all of the books I read in January. Let me know what you read and what your favorites were, and maybe I'll read them in February. No promises, but like maybe. And I'll see you next time. Bye.